Welcome to Techlandia, a podcast about and for the technology industry, a place to learn, connect, and engage with leaders and thinkers involved in the technology industry. You can check us out at techoregon.org, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Welcome to the latest edition of Techlandia, TAO's regular podcast series. I'm Skip Newberry, and today we have with us Paul Lesinski, who is with Edelman. Paul, thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Excellent. Well, we're excited to get your insight on the ever-evolving media landscape. Wanted to start off by asking you if you could maybe talk a little bit about the recent Edelman Trust Barometer, and what it says about the overall state of play. And maybe if you could start too by just essentially explaining a little bit about what the Trust Barometer is.
Sure. Yeah, I'll do even one more. So for people who don't know, Edelman, we're the largest independent PR firm in the world. Tech-wise, we've got about 100 plus people in the U.S. that are part of what we call a tech specialty pool. And so we work with clients, everybody from enterprise tech to consumer tech. And when people ask me, what do you do exactly? I've learned to sort of simplify it down to we just help our clients tell their story, whatever that is, whether that's a product launch or whether that's executive, thought leadership or, a million things in between. But that's basically what I do. And then, Edelman, we do a survey. I think this was the 24th year we've done it. And we surveyed, I'm looking here, this year it was about 32,000 people, a lot of people in 28 countries. And what we're doing is measuring trust. And we're measuring trust in different entities like government, media, business, NGOs. And no great shock, the last I got to say 4 or 5 years, trust just tanked everywhere. Nobody trusts anything, and it's really problematic. Trust in the media is at an all-time low. This year, what we found is sort of a rerun of the last couple of years, where interestingly, businesses are the most are more trusted than the government, than media, and but at the same time, businesses are sort of expected to lead, and there's a bit of a gap there, where, for example, in the U.S., more than 50% of people said that innovation is really not well managed by business. So there's kind of this it's a really fluid situation in terms of who people trust for information and to do the right thing and to do more good than harm, I guess you could say. So, that's kind of my top line, take on what we just launched at Davos about a month ago.
Well, that's great. I mean, I think there's a natural tension there that you've highlighted in those findings, that's highly relevant for a lot of our members, who many of them are developing and working with cutting edge technologies, things like artificial intelligence. Some are operating in the climate tech space. Others are in biotechnology. And if you look at some of the areas where, there's growing sort of distrust around motivations, business models, power dynamics, et cetera, a lot of times it's centered around those kind of emerging technologies. And I'm wondering, do you see that continuing? You mentioned there's this trend line you're seeing over the last few years where there's this natural tension between innovation on the one hand and risk on the other. How would you propose that companies kind of navigate that?
I just think what we have seen, in the research is that companies, they need to stand for something. And it's not just for the customers of that company, but it's even for their own employees. The last couple of years, we've seen employees say that, they expect that their CEO, takes a stand on an issue or or at least says something, right? Like not saying or doing anything is not really an option. And look, I've been in Portland for a long time. I worked with tons of our tech companies, large and small, and I get it. Like when a company is just getting started, that's not really something. I mean, look, they're trying to pay their employees and build a business, and it's like kind of the last thing on their mind is like, well, how am I going to contribute to like the larger kind of like climate issues that are happening or whatever. Um, but really to be a good citizen, that's what's more and more expected.
I'm wondering, what are some of the ways that you're seeing companies kind of tackle that? Is it all over the board, or are there certain kind of proven methods that folks are relying on? Like by way of example, there's a couple of companies we work with locally that have tried to develop sort of a roadmap, if you will, of where they'll engage and what issues are important by starting with a survey of their employees internally, and then saying, okay, from a volunteer effort in terms of how we show up in the community and what we maybe speak out on, these are the areas that we're going to kind of focus on. And you can contrast that with other companies in our membership that are just going to stay within kind of a narrow swim lane, as it were, related to their product and market and the customers that they're serving. So how do you, like, is there a one size fits all approach here, or how are you seeing companies kind of navigate that?
Well, no, there isn't. And you've given me a great reason to pivot a little bit into the media discussion, because this is one of the things, right? We sometimes will have a client who says, hey, we really need to tell, a women in technology story. And so I say, okay, well, who are your women executives? Oh, we don't have any. So it's like, well, you don't have a story then, right?
Right.
And so I think that my sort of brutally frank evaluation is that whatever it is, it has to be real and genuine. It can't be, we all have heard the term greenwashing, but it can't be greenwashing. And I think that, excuse me, some of the examples would be, let's say you're a company that's a cloud provider or AI, both great examples. I think that we all know that, that's a very resource heavy industry, right? Like cloud computing and just the energy that it takes, to process, AI algorithms and whatnot. It's a tax on the economy. So or not the economy, the environment. So one example would be like, how do you offset that? Are you making commitments to, sort of be a good citizen when it comes to the impact that your company is having on the environment? And I think those are probably more akin for tech than something like a socially awareness stance. It's more along the lines of climate, more along the lines of offsetting like impact. But certainly it could also be, giving back to the community. And of course, Oregon has always been very, very pro that. So those are other examples.
That's great. I mean, one of the areas that I think was highlighted in the Trust Barometer report was AI and artificial intelligence, and that seems to be an area that folks are both a mix of excited and have some serious trepidation around. Okay, is it going to be a boon to society and make our jobs better? Or is it going to replace everyone's jobs and we're all going to be worse off for it? Or is it going to fall into the hands of a nation state that is adverse to the US and they're going to use it to their advantage? Or are we going to use it to solve some of these big societal issues that face us, right? So it seems to be relatively split. So I'm wondering, for a tech company that is using AI or developing it, what are some things that you think they should be thinking about as they're looking at messaging?
It goes back to what we were just talking about with greenwashing. There's also the notion of AI washing, right? I think that when AI got really, really hot with ChatGPT and everything else the last, 6 to 9 months, everybody decided they needed to have an AI story. And some of it was legit. If a company really is using AI in a meaningful way and there's a story that they can tell there, then by all means tell it. But, don't jump on a bandwagon because the media is very gun shy about that, right? I mean, I think this is another thing. Just again, getting into the media landscape, so many reporters, I don't know, maybe burned is not the right word, but there is a sense that they'll cover an industry, or they'll cover even a company, right, that they get excited about, and then in a year, it ended up being kind of a flash in the pan, and doesn't make them look good, or they could have spent their time on something different. So I think that AI is in the same boat. Reporters are incredibly vigilant with any pitches that have anything to do with AI. Like it's got to be real.
That's a great point, and it kind of relates to this idea that as a tech company or any business, you kind of have to know your customer in order to be effective in engaging them and selling something to them, right? And I'm wondering, in the context of reporters and their editors, what are some things that tech companies should think about as they're looking to pitch a story or get their attention?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it's interesting because I know why you asked it, and the question was specifically about reporters. And what I always ask a company, if I'm meeting the comms lead, or anybody that I'm going to work with, or just having lunch with somebody, I always ask, who is your audience? Like, it has to start there. Like, who are you trying to tell like I said earlier, like, my job, among other things, is to help a company tell its story. So great. Who's the audience for that story? Of course, usually it's, whoever they want to, it's a sales thing, right? It's whoever they want to buy their service or their product. But sometimes it's, well, you know what? It's the investor community, because we're trying to raise a Series D or whatever. So the audience is there. There's usually more than one. But I always ask that, and I'm always really, really surprised when I get an answer where, like, they don't actually really know exactly who the audience is. Like, the answer is, well, it's everybody, or it's technology buyers, and it's just like, ooh. So one thing is just to really figure that out, like, who exactly are you trying to get these messages to? Then what I love to do in my role is reverse engineer that, and then be like, okay, great. So your audience is the CIO and the CTO. So what we're going to do is figure out, well, I already know the answer to this one, but, like, where do those people get their information? So funny enough, another piece of research Edelman does is we partner with LinkedIn, and we do these B2B studies about content that, like, almost every company, generates owned content, and they have a B2B program and whatnot. Funny enough, C-level decision makers still rely on newsletters, like email newsletters, which, I think a lot of people would think, like, really? But they do. And we know that because we asked them. So, your pitches, like, media-wise, should go to, like, the Axioses of the world, or the Bloombergs of the world in the old days when protocol was a thing, because they had a lot of newsletters. So it's like you have to kind of figure out, where does your audience get its information? And then you reverse engineer your programming so that you're hitting them laser focused. And it isn't always media. In fact, sometimes I will meet with companies, and, after talking a little bit, I'm like, you know what? They come to me and they say, we just need to get an article in the New York Times. And it's like, well, first of all, that's really, really difficult to do, and it takes years. But
Right.
But is that really what you want? Because the buyer you're telling me about, they don't get their information from the New York Times. They're actually, like, let's say it's the developer community. Okay, that's like user groups, events. They're very networked. They don't, so you kind of have to figure that out. And sometimes I'll say, you don't need a media program. You're wasting your money. You need, like, a targeted, ABM program or something like that. So again, just understanding who that audience is really going to kind of, everything ladders down from there.
So you also raised the point about kind of reaching your audience where they already are, and you referenced a couple of newsletters, for example, that are pretty widely read. Do you also see companies having success kind of developing their own audience over time, or maybe they're trying to like, develop their own newsletter of some sort? And I guess that raises a larger question of really about thought leadership. Like, how can a small company that has limited resources kind of establish itself as a thought leader in terms of the space that it's addressing?
That's a great question, Skip. Well, and funny enough, this is something that happens quite a bit. Like, there's certain companies and clients that are just like, they just put press releases out all the time, right? There's others, which I wouldn't recommend, by the way. There's others where it's like, it's kind of few and far between. Like the news, pegs are maybe like weeks apart, or it's like, you know what, we're not going to have a new product out for like 2 months. What are we going to do? Well, you hit the nail on the head. If you want to be, if you want your audience to sort of respect the company, they, it's more than just like, oh yeah, this product is great or the service is great. It's like the people who are behind it, are subject matter experts on a certain topic that's related to the industry. So going back to AI, if you have like an AI, guru at your company, or somebody who's been in the industry for a bit, that's the kind of person that you could build a thought leadership program around. But they have to be saying something that not everybody else is saying, right? They have to put a stake in the ground and say something. The other really effective way is data-driven storytelling. And so there's a couple ways to do that. One of them is the obvious, where you do like a survey. And even then, sometimes surveys are a little bit hard to place because there's a lot of data out there. And again, it has to be something that, is like new and interesting. But the other way is like if a company is sitting on its own data. And I'll give you a great example. So one of our current clients is called Eightfold AI, and they use AI for HR. They basically help HR professionals hire people based on what that person has the potential to do based on their experience, as opposed to like what they've done in the past. And there's other nuances to it. I'm really simplifying it. But as you can imagine, they're sitting on a mound of data that has to do with HR and the workforce. And they were able to actually put together a unique viewpoint when the CHIPS Act was signed. And, the idea was to bring chip manufacturing back to the United States. Well, Eightfold was able to say, listen, that's great, obviously. But to make that a success, you would need another 80,000 people. I think it was 80,000 people who don't exist right now that have skills to work in that industry. And Skip, I'm telling you, man, we placed that stat for like a year and a half because nobody else had it. It was sort of contentious, right? It was like, and you got to think about, like, again, people are the media is looking for things that are going to be a little bit head turning, not sensationalism. I'm not talking about making something up or saying something super controversial, but just something that, that is a unique viewpoint that is relevant to like what's going on in the world today. And so, for example, that stat just got us loads of mileage. And I know for a fact, the other thing to think about is when you get a media hit, what are you doing with it, right? Because, excuse me, it'll just live, for a week and then go away. You got to put paid behind it and, use it as part of your ABM strategy, things like that.
That's great. That's definitely a valuable advice. And I think too, like we've covered so far some examples where tactically companies can be very proactive in getting their message out there. And I'm wondering if we could shift a little bit and talk about what are some of the areas where, being prepared for the inevitable thing that goes sideways, right? A data breach, or there's a cybersecurity issue, or a product ends up going completely sideways and a customer, complaint goes viral, right? So the things that are likely to happen at some point and companies should be prepared for. So what do you tell companies you're working with in terms of how to be ready for the inevitable?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think it's sort of a case by case. There's some situations where, the best course of action is to not do anything, because a lot of times what happens is if you if you put yourself out there, you just extend the news cycle. But there are a lot of cases where, something does need to happen. And in that case, I think a lot of times, like the advice we always give is just be honest. Like if a mistake was made, you have to admit to the mistake, and then you have to discuss what you're doing about it and what you're going to do so it doesn't happen again. And, again, that's something that we advise our clients on, but it just depends on what their industry is and what those types of things might be. But that's kind of the playbook is like, again, you got to hold on one sec. Sorry, I've been talking way too much today.
No worries.
Again, go laddering back to trust. It's all about trust and relationships in business, right? I mean, we all know that. It's the same way with trust in the media. It's the same way with, trust with your customers. So if a company makes a mistake or has something happen to it that's negative, the best thing they can do is, within reason, of course, is to, admit what happened and then say why it's not going to happen again. And then make sure it doesn't happen again. Otherwise,
Right.
I mean, you've heard that old adage, right? You build trust for 5 years and you can break it in 5 minutes. So, yeah. So that's what I would generally advise. But then we need to kind of drill into it and figure out, like, well, what does this company exactly do, and what are the possible pitfalls that could happen?
Yep. And that raises a great point too about, how exactly do companies work with agencies like yours or others? It's like, what are there certain best practices there, and how early should companies consider in their development getting engaged with, a PR and communications firm?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I think it always, again, to me, ladders back to the whole audience question, because I mean, the business person in me wants to say, well, always and anytime. But again, like I say, sometimes I'll meet a company, and after having a good long chat, I'm honest, and I just say, I don't think you need an agency right now. I think what you need is a consultant. I think what you need is somebody who can write a lot of great content and put it up on, like, this is another Edelman adage: every company is a publisher, or should be. Again, just like the notion of owned coverage, meaning that it's an article that you write, and it's not just on your own blog, but I mean, most publications will take contributed content, especially niche verticals, because we haven't talked about this just yet, but the media landscape, there's fewer reporters, there's fewer outlets. The reporters that are left are asked to do way more with way less. And, so they're open to opinion pieces, or like tips and tricks, or, predictions for the next year, things like that. So getting back to your question, sometimes they'll say, like, look, you don't really need like an always on PR firm at this stage. What you really need to do is just sort of build the foundation of the visibility of your company, and really understand who that audience is. And then let's talk, and then we can build like some strategy that goes across like a whole bunch of different programs and means, to get to that audience. So that's kind of the first conversation I have, is I'm really just trying to understand where a company is at, and what they, who they're really trying to connect with, and why, where they're at.
That's great. No, that's great advice. I'm wondering too, if we look at what things have changed since the start of the pandemic, versus today. In our world, in association land, as it were, there's definitely some things that have stuck in the way of new trends, and then there's things that are kind of reverting back to, pre-pandemic.
Mhm.
One thing I've noticed is that when it comes to the proliferation of like digital forms of communication, and more hybrid and remote work too, in particular, there's a lot more noise, it seems, in terms of both content and email marketing and just a lot more like digital stuff out there, right, on a regular basis. And I'm
Yeah.
wondering, are there certain things that you've seen over the last few years that are kind of newer trends there around how to cut through the noise that companies should try to keep top of mind?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question because this is like maybe one of the most important things I could tell the tech community, and it goes back to that survey I was talking about that we do with LinkedIn every year. And again, it's about B2B content. So it's basically if you have an ABM program or like a content generation program, this is exactly relating to that. So what we found, again, by polling actual C-level decision makers at companies, is that if content that, to your point, Skip, all this digital content that companies are creating, for example, and the different ways that that gets out, whether that's their own newsletter or their own like lead gen program, if that content is really good, then I'm sorry, I don't have the number in front of me, but it's a high probability that they are going to be in the decision set in terms of like, I want to talk to that company. They seem smart. They seem like they know what they're doing. We should talk to them for sure. So that's, kind of a no-brainer, I guess. But the converse was really true. If it was done poorly, it immediately knocks the company out of the decision set. So it's like you have to, if you have a plan where you're creating, content, it's got to be good. And if it isn't, you're almost like shooting yourself in the foot. So that's one thing I'll say. The other thing I'll say is that, which is more of a positive, is you're asking like what's kind of maybe rebounded since the craziness of the pandemic. So yes, reporters are, super stretched and all that, but the notion of in person is kind of back. And that means, media going to trade shows, media being more willing to do like a one-on-one, like a coffee meeting or whatever. And again, this has to be presented in a way that, you know, you're not asking the media to do something for you. It's more like, look, I could be of help to you. You know what I mean? Like I can give you data and insights that you cannot get anywhere else, such as that eightfold semiconductor stat I gave you earlier. It's got to be kind of a mutual offer, but in person has rebounded in a way that, like, I think may happen a little quicker than people thought it would. So there's a couple of points to your question.
No, that's great. So I'm going to go a little bit off, hopefully not on a complete tangent, but
Do
if you
it.
could take your sort of Edelman hat off for a second, just Paul, the comms and PR expert who happens to be in the area in the Northwest, like what are you seeing in terms of the national perception related to Portland? And most people you talk to in recent years would say, one of the challenges facing Portland right now is a national perception problem.
Yeah.
And so what are some things that you're seeing out there that maybe point to that trend, but then also personally, what do you see as a potential path forward for helping to correct that
Oh
in
man.
in the national context?
I, I don't know. I wish I could. If I had the answer to that, I'd start my own consulting firm. No, I mean, in all seriousness, Skip, I think, again, I'll take my Edelman hat off for a second, but with it on or off, it's the same answer. Like it feels like the New York Times has some kind of like 3 times a year quota to do some crappy article about Portland. I mean, and until that changes, this is the other thing is, it's just tough, right? Like I think we all thought I mean, I don't know, as soon as the pandemic hit and everything else that's happened since then in terms of politics in the US, all the wars, it's like there's never a moment where there is a news lull of some crazy stuff happening somewhere in the world. And that's tough to break through, right? It's really, really tough to break through. And so, the bar is just so high, unless you're like a public company, and that's different. Then we could get you on CNBC or Bloomberg talking about your earnings, talking about how your company's transforming. But like, man, to like break through that insane news cycle where there literally just does not seem to be a slow day, much less a slow week, it's just hard. It's just hard. And that's not really answering your Portland question. That's just for like, setting a reality check for any company that says, hey, I want to get in the, front page of the New York Times or something, or get on CNBC. Again, I question if there's even value in that, aside from if you're trying to raise money or just awareness for the brand. But there's more laser targeted ways to get to your audience than something like that. But in terms of your Portland question, I mean, I think that there just sort of has to be a kind of an inverse campaign where any success that we have, gets trumpeted. And unfortunately, that's not generally what opens, that's not generally what, I have to do a news. I mean, this is crazy, right? Because it's my business, but sometimes I do a media freeze myself. I'm like, I'm not going to go on CNN and New York Times today. I just don't want to know what's happening because it's all negative. And there's just a fatigue, right? So I know that like a positive Portland story is going to be harder to secure than all the negative ones. But I think that if there really was some kind of like meaningful, change, that's going to be the thing that starts to turn it with the national perspective or perception rather. But, that's a probably a multi-year effort. You probably know that better than I do, Skip.
Well, just a positive data point. This morning I was meeting with someone who's from out of town, company that does a lot of business with semiconductor firms as well as some clean tech and also municipalities. And he was saying just he sees an opportunity for more innovation and work going on here. And after our conversation, he's like, honestly, I was excited about the area even before our conversation, but he's like, there's a lot more depth and activity and really innovative projects going on here than I was even aware.
Yeah.
And so I think it's not a new problem for this area in terms of there's been some great stuff going on for a long time on a regular basis, and it's often not really talked about and not shared widely beyond,
right,
kind of the local crowd, if you will. But
sure,
I think you're right. There's definitely a challenge there, and it's a long-term, multi-pronged one. But I do think that we've got some interesting material to work with.
I agree.
It is positive. Yeah.
And where my, our office is right by Pioneer Courthouse Square. So I'm down here, 3-4 times, 3-4 days a week. I've noticed a change. I've absolutely noticed a change in the last, 2 or 3 months in terms of just like, it feels like everything's bouncing back a bit. There's good energy, there's more places open. It's feeling less, less kind of pandemic era. And I just think that takes time to trickle, even through our own city, much less nationwide. I also saw an interesting article, I'm sure you read, right? Which was that, with the return to office now being, for most part, hybrid everywhere, the bounce back on people coming to downtown is probably close to hitting the ceiling. And there was this whole notion of like, well, you know what, downtown just needs to be more like where people also live, not just work. And I know a lot of cities face that, but obviously that's a multi-year thing too. But I think that certainly, I think there's kind of a transformation that'll probably happen over time.
I think we're on the same page. Totally agree. So I want to say thank you for taking some time out of your busy schedule to join us. And as we wrap up, like any sort of final words here for our audience?
I hope it was helpful. I was riffing, I don't do a lot of these, but my role in the office here is I'm an SVP in the tech, the tech group. And despite my answer, which was, sometimes companies are not ready, they don't know, right? So like I'm always open to talking to anybody, right? So if any company is just like, you know what, I'm super interested in just like maybe taking this to part 2 and spitballing a little bit, like, here's what we're doing with our comms, like, what are we missing? Whatever, because we work with companies of all sizes. You know what I mean? I took a company out of stealth mode. It was like a real estate technology company out of Chicago. Interestingly, like, forget Series A, B, C, D. They weren't even on the radar. So like, we work with companies of all sizes in tech, and I mean, I hope you hear it in my voice, but like, I've been at Edelman now for 25 years as of last Sunday. I'm just super passionate about technology. I think it's just a fun space to be in. The stories are amazing in Portland, or all of Oregon, really. It's just a vibrant community. We've worked with dozens of companies here, and I just love what I do. So like, if any company that's listening to this is just like, yeah, I'm just kind of curious as to like, what your feedback might be, I'm always up for a coffee or a chat. So that's what I'll leave you with.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Paul. It was a pleasure to have you on as always. And yeah, look forward to doing this again.
Right on. Thank you, Skip. I really appreciate it, man.